Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. It is, again, Wednesday. Today is the middle of July. It is the 15th day of July. And needless to say, it is my pleasure, my honor, to be with you for yet another broadcast here at the Virtual Center. I want to thank Bob and the folks at the Head On Radio Network for continuing to support this program. And I want to thank you, those of you who are tuning in, for your loyalty and your willingness to give us your valuable time on a regular basis. If you are a new listener, and I know we've got a few, we put up I put up a Facebook page just last week, and I'm hearing from and getting names of people that that are first for me, people that I did not know. And my friends list is expanding, needless to say. And I'm trying to direct as much attention as I can among these new friends to the Virtual Center page on Facebook, and I invite you to do the same. It is entitled that, the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution. It'll get you to it. I want to take a moment at the outset here today to apologize. I posted a short message on Facebook last evening, and did apologize for not being here to deliver yesterday's program. I got involved in moving some furniture yesterday morning, quite a bit of furniture actually, to help my wife out, and it ended. It so happened that I ended up to be more than an hour away from home, and we began early in the morning, 8:15 or so, and as the noon hour came and went, it became clear that I was not going to get back in time. So I called Bob Kincaid in the Horn Studios and asked them if they could make some sort of a substitute for yesterday's program, because I didn't think I was going to be able to make it. I apologize, and of course we'll pick up and hopefully do today what I had hoped we would be doing yesterday. And I'm guessing that we might be able to put a final period, if you will, on this whole issue of the Greek debt bailout today. But if we don't, we'll pick it up a little bit further in our next program, which will be next Monday. Again, besides the Facebook page, and I'll go back over that again, but I want to make sure that all of those listening, that you have the phone number that'll get you on the air, so that we can have a little bit of conversation, a little bit of chat. After all, as Bob announces at the start of the program, this is an ongoing conversation. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, conversations usually require more than one person. There's a distinct difference between a monologue and a dialogue. And at the same time, I realize that much of the information that is being presented here is new to folks. And I appreciate that. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult to pick up the phone and express an opinion, especially when there are any number of people listening whom you don't know. Most of us don't want to risk making a fool of ourselves or saying something that doesn't seem intelligent and appropriate. I understand that. It's a little bit difficult. I'm sure, as I do, that we are in an age where there are a significant number of people out there, it appears, who have no problem at all expressing their opinion on just about anything and everything. And of course, once they become mired in a particular ideological framework, if you will, then not only are they able to talk about in anything and everything, but they in effect become experts on the various subjects. It doesn't matter what the subject is, because these people always have a ready-made answer to bring up. But we know that intelligent thinking people who recognize that learning is never over and that we all have the potential and the opportunity to continue learning throughout our lives, those are the people that listen to the Head On Radio Network. Those are the people that tune into the Virtual Center. And those people feel that before you take the microphone, you really ought to at least believe that you have something valuable or worthwhile to say. And if you don't, then you feel that your best option is to just not say anything. And believe me, I can understand that. And then there is the other issue of some people just are shy. And some people, while they are very, very articulate, when they get in front of a microphone or they're talking before an audience, it becomes very difficult for them. And I can understand that. I was one of those myself all through schools. I used to shiver in fear that a teacher would call on me for anything. And I used to do everything that I could do to remain invisible in class after class, grade after grade, year after year. And I began to define educational success on a daily or a weekly basis by measuring the number of times or the number of classes I was able to attend where nobody acknowledged my presence even. Unfortunately, one of the things I've noted over the years is that seems to be a position of more and more of our students, unfortunately. They become they almost relegate themselves to become the role of receptacles, and they're just willing to take and listen to whatever anybody who's hired to stand up in front of them throws at them. And obviously, we're about a lot more than that here at the Virtual Center. But I do invite you to pick up the phone and give us a call and make your concerns, your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions known. Because I think if you have something that you feel is valuable enough to say that you're willing to pick up the phone and make a call and get on the air with any number of people whom you don't know, I think that in itself indicates that what you have to say is probably very valuable, not only to me, but to other people listening to the Virtual Center as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, and I keep emphasizing that because so many O'Briens spell their name I-A-N. And mine is I-E-N, and the difference, of course, in the Irish heritage is the difference between origins in Southern Ireland, the Republic, or in Northern Ireland. And I know I grew up in a household where my dad used to make very, very regular assertions as to the difference. I've mentioned this before as an aside, but there used to be a TV program, a weekly TV program on television years ago called Bat Masterson. And the actor who played Bat Masterson, of course, was Hugh O'Brien. And his name was O-B-R-I-A-N. My dad used to make the point all the time. Notice that A-N. Notice. That tells you an awful lot, So anyway, it's waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, I invite you to go to the internet, to Facebook, and take a look at the Facebook page on the virtual. It is entitled the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and I have posted there a couple of pieces that I've written in recent weeks, recent months, I have a lot more that I want to put up there. I'm not necessarily putting something up every day, but I don't like to let more than 2 or 3 days go by before I post something else. And in fact, one of the things that I'm planning to do tomorrow, probably, since we do not have a program tomorrow here at the Virtual Center, is to put together a piece that I'd like to post on Facebook sometime, the end of this week, as it were, on Thomas Jefferson and Jefferson's ideas about education. We spent a lot of time here at the Virtual Center on those in previous months, and I've written quite a bit about Jefferson's ideas on education in a number of different venues, a number of different places, and I want to take a few hours and pull some of that stuff together and organize it in ways that seem to make some sense, and post it, because I think a number of the people who would be tuning in to the Facebook, who would be looking at the Facebook page, once they begin to see some of these pieces, they may get a little bit more interested in becoming listeners and hopefully callers here at the Virtual Center during our Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday live programs. I remind you again that all of our programs, our past programs, are available, have been archived by the White Rose Society. And so if you go on your internet to whiterosesociety.org and you scroll down after you get the introduction to the White Rose Society as a page, as a liberal voice, if you will, in political discussion in this country, and you scroll down, you will see table of contents. And under table of contents, you will see reference to me personally and our programs. And all of our programs are being archived on the White Rose Society, and I know Bob Kincaid is responsible for doing this. And I don't exactly know, I never asked him, but I'm guessing that it probably takes him a day or two to get these things archived. But they're pretty close to current. And also, I might mention that Horst, our regular participant out in Taiwan, Horst has taken it on himself to put a number of our programs on YouTube. And so if you go to YouTube and you mention my name, Dr. Bill O'Brien, you will get a posting of some of our programs as well. And Horst has taken it upon himself, as he has posted these things on YouTube, to put together a sentence or two about the programs in order to give you an idea before you click on to a program that probably extends for an hour and a half or 2 hours. You obviously want to know what it's about. I mean, the date is fine, but it doesn't tell you what the theme of the program is, and Horst has taken it upon himself to do that as well, and I appreciate him doing that so much. It obviously has expanded the number of people who have become listeners here at the Virtual Center, and I do appreciate that so much. So again, our phone number, 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. And our Facebook page is listed under the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution. I invite you to go to any one or all of these and make yourself known. Feel free to comment. Feel free to offer your suggestions. I have requested, because this is what Facebook asks of us, I have requested people who go to the Facebook page to like it, which what that essentially means is you click the like button, and that kind of registers you as a contact to the page. And this morning, the page has been up just about a week now, and this morning, for the first time from Facebook, I got a breakdown as to the number of people and the number of hits on the Virtual Center page in the first 4 or 5 days that it's been up. And I was encouraged, because the number of hits on that page in the first 5 days, at least the number that was given to me, is 219. And I thought that was, for 5 days, I thought that was wonderful. And the number of individual people who made it a point to look at the page, was 39 of 40. And I think that's encouraging. So again, thank you. And please feel free to make yourselves known. I would love to interact with you, whether it be on the air here, whether it be by email, whether it be on Facebook, however it is. I really believe that what we're talking about is tremendously important. And some of the things we talk about and some of the things we do with the things we talk about, I believe, is extremely important because it basically raises issues and puts items and elements of the most important issues of our day on the table that I don't think are going to be raised anywhere else. I believe that the perspective that we try to develop here, is one that must be there if society's decisions are going to remain viable and valuable. I hope that you will agree with me. And as you become much more of a participant and a regular listener, I hope you will feel free to let me know what I might do to make this experience even better. Bob and I are working on this. We're talking down the road, obviously, about shifting to video. But again, I have the perfect face for audio. I'm not sure about video. But anyway, welcome to the Virtual Center. I thank you. I want to get back, as I noted in my post on Facebook yesterday, I want to return to the issue of the Greek debt bailout. And I want to begin with a review, especially since we missed yesterday. I'd like to begin with a little bit of an overview or a review of some of the issues that we touched upon on Monday, and then I'd like to pick up and deal with a few more considerations that I think are relevant. Let me begin, if I may. And again, even though I'm into this, please don't feel the phones are still there and the phones are still on. So if in the middle of this you feel that you would like to raise an issue or a point or a question or highlight or re-emphasize or question a particular point or a particular viewpoint that I might be expressing, by all means, I would love to hear from you. Please don't feel that you'll be interfering or anything else. You will not be, because this is about you. This whole effort is about you. What really drives me in putting these programs together and in conducting the research and doing the research that gives me access to some of the information I would need in order to present these programs, is the fact that I believe you, all of you, will benefit from it, hopefully, from my work. And it's a faith that I have in that basically keeps me going here at the Virtual Center. So please don't feel that there's a good time or not a good time for you to be heard from. Any time that you want to be heard from is a good time for all of us, and I want you to know that. I'd like to begin this review, and again, we're talking about the situation that's been going on in Greece. The articles, I've been going back over my information. I've compiled a folder now, which is probably in excess of 25 or 30 items that I have seen worth printing off, reading, marking up, underlining, highlighting, starring, bracketing paragraphs for quotes that I would want to bring to your attention here at the Virtual Center. There are a number of these articles because I believe it's that important. And this issue first began to get attention here in the United States at the end of June. I have a number of articles from the 29th of June, the 30th of June. And so from then up until now, the issue has been obviously on the front pages all over the world. Obviously, it's that important. Something that I wanted to raise today as an opening because I think this is significant, and I'm making a judgment call here, and I'm going to apologize for it at the beginning because I'm not sure I'm right, but I think I am. This morning in the New York Times, there were two contributions, two articles dealing with the Greek, debt crisis. And let me share with you quickly what they are. One of them, well, I think I've misplaced my materials here, and I sure as heck don't want to do that. Hang on with me one moment. The point that I wanted to make is that there were two pieces in this morning's New York Times on the Greek situation. One of them was by Stephen Ratner, who's a member of who's been on Wall Street for a number of years. He writes articles and op-ed pieces. I've seen him on a number of panels on MSNBC, especially. He's considered to be an extremely reputable economic columnist. I guess you could consider him an economist. He's definitely a student of what's going on in the area of finance and international finance. He wrote what I thought was an excellent piece in this morning's New York Times. And what I'm interested in, and the point I wanted to make, I always look at the comments. Many of you, if you're regular readers of some of these prominent newspapers, whether it be the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, the Washington Times, which is a conservative paper, the Wall Street Journal, all of them have a comment, and they invite comments from those who read the articles. And they make the comments available to all readers. So if you go and look at the op-eds in the New York Times, for example, which I do daily, and you start reading a particular article, when you get about beyond halfway through, 3/4 of the way through an article, on the left-hand side of the computer screen, you'll see a highlighted section called comments. And it will tell you the number of comments on this particular article up to that point. And if you click that comments button, on the right-hand side you will get a list of all the comments. And I can tell you, because it's the New York Times, some of the pieces that I have found most valuable, some of the David Brooks pieces, and some of the other people by some of the regular columnists in the New York Times, the numbers of comments for many of these articles usually run into the 200s, 300s, 400s. I've even seen them as high as the 500s and 600s. In other words, you'll get an article that is read and so much that individuals who read them are inclined or moved to respond to them and make a comment. And the New York Times and the Washington Post and others list these comments. The reason I mention this is because the Steve Ratner piece that's in this morning New York Times on the Greek crisis. I looked at it about 11 a.m., about an hour before noon today. It had one comment. Then I looked at the opinion pages of the Times, and lo and behold, there was another article in the Times this morning, another op-ed piece, by an economist who had just returned from a conference in Germany, in Munich, within the past week. And his particular piece was on German economists and the extent to which Germany seems to be really reeling under this Greek crisis. Because much of the focus has been on Angela Merkel and on Germany as being the hardliner here when it comes to the Greek bailout. Most people have agreed that it's the Germans that are most adamant about holding the Greek government, holding its feet to the fire, as it were. And that's what this particular article in this morning's Times is about. It is about the extent to which there's a sense of anger within Germany because of the negative publicity that Germany is receiving here. And in fact, the economist who writes the piece makes the point that in a sense, Germany is almost trying to portray itself as the victim of this crisis. In other words, we're getting pasted and blasted here because of our insistence that the Greek government repay its debts. And he touches on 3 or 4 of the Greek economists from Germany, that were at this conference. And he points out the positions taken by a number of them. One wanted Greece thrown out of the Eurozone. In other words, their behavior is so bad and sets such a bad example for the other members of the European Union that they ought to be expelled. They're overspending. They have been overspending for a long time. While they have claimed to be adopting one reform after the other to bring about greater austerity, the fact of the matter is that while indeed they have, the reality is that they had gone so far overboard in their inclination to overspend and to live beyond their means that whatever moves they make toward austerity are not nearly enough. And so consequently, these people believe that Greece ought to be made to pay for the extremes and the excesses of its economic foolhardiness, if you will. I thought it was a pretty relevant article for the information it provided. It adds a significant perspective to this whole controversy, this whole issue. It also received one comment from New York Times readers. I have never seen that before. I have seen articles from columnists in the Times that get a relatively small number of comments. I've seen articles that get a huge number of comments. I've seen David Brooks articles that'll get 560, 575 comments. One of the regular columnists at the New York Times that I particularly enjoy is Gail Collins. She writes a piece on Thursdays and on Saturdays. And Gail Collins has one of the sharpest wits and the most incisive sense of humor that I've read among prominent columnists in some time. Her pieces always get hundreds of comments because people enjoy reading her. The information in her columns is important, but much richer usually are her comments and the wit that she brings to the table. But I have seen occasional comments which don't get that much attention. Maybe they'll get 150, 160 comments, 220 comments, something like that. But one, I have never seen it before. Now today is a Wednesday, and I tried to think, is there a reason why there would be so many fewer, there would be so much less commenting today than other days? And I don't know if there is a reason. I don't know what it might be. So I spent a little bit of time this morning thinking about that, and there are a number of, there are different perspectives or different spins that you could put on this. Maybe the reason there's only one comment on each of these two pieces on the Greek crisis is because the Greek crisis has been around now for a couple of weeks, and maybe many people think it's time to move on. Everything worth saying has been said. I'm hoping that on our program today, and we are 25% into it. We've just passed the bottom of the first hour, so we've got another hour and a half to go. I'm hoping that in that hour and a half, we'll be able to recognize, as we move toward the end of our time together today, that everything that could be said about the Greek crisis was indeed not said. Because I think there's a lot more to say. I think it's that rich and that important. So, do the regular readers of the New York Times believe that the issue really ought to be off the table now because it's dead, it's old news? There's another possibility that occurred to me in trying to explain one comment on each of these two pieces. Because we have to recognize each of these two pieces is on the New York Times, which is considered to be one of the world's, not the America's, but the world's most important forums, most important newspapers. Maybe the one comment on each of these articles suggests not so much that the issue of the Greek bailout is old news and it's time to move on. Maybe the story is that the issue has become so complex and so involved because it deals with high-level economics, international economics. This is in the category of brain surgery to most people, and I'm one of them. I find this extremely difficult, as I'm sure many of you do, to slog through, because I'm not an economist. And some of this, I read some of the charts and some of the graphs and look at some of the data, and I say, my God, this is confusing. This is really deep stuff. Maybe what we're looking at has become so complicated that people have lost the ability to know what to say. Maybe we've lost the majority of those people that are into this subject. One of the things that I decided to do in preparation for our programs on this is to try to take an issue that I recognized was becoming extremely complicated and extremely multifaceted, And my goal is to try to take some of the major issues and lay them out in ways which make some sense. I don't know what the answer is here, but I find that there are a variety of different possibilities. And we touched on a number of those on Monday. There is absolutely no question. I have 2 or 3 sources that particularly validate this particular perspective. There is no question that some people, I don't know how many, but some people believe that the real issue in this whole controversy is nothing about whether Greece pays or doesn't pay its debts. The real issue here is to create the kind of confusion and complexity associated with Greek behavior that forces the Greek government to fall. In other words, a significant perspective in this whole story is political. The Greek government of President Tsipras is leftist. It is socialist. It has adopted behavior and programs which are much more closely associated with socialism than with capitalism. Greek behavior within the context of the euro, of the European Union, has given rise to an element of socialist behavior within a highly involved, highly significant international capitalist context. And there's no question that the members of the European Union right down the line all agree that they want to see the Tsipras government fall. And so consequently, they have everything to gain by overstating the debt, overstating the severity of the debt, overstating the irresponsible behavior of the Greek government and the Greek and obviously some of the Greek people. I don't know whether that is the story, but I do know that it's part of it. It's a factor that colors the information we receive and the way that that information is presented. There is absolutely no question that this is true. And I'm going to one of the sources. Let me find Ratner's article here. Here it is. This is the one from this morning's New York Times. Steve Ratner. Steve Ratner, I've seen him many times on television. He's a Wall Street executive. He's a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He's a regular panelist on MSNBC. He's extremely knowledgeable and articulate about international trade and commerce. And he writes his piece today, which is kind of in contrast to the other one in today's New York Times, which is about the level of anger that exists within Germany because they feel like they're being portrayed as they're being made the victim in this whole thing. Ratner takes on a position that one would not at all be surprised by, given the fact that he's a Wall Street executive. It is to criticize the behavior of Greece and to applaud Germany for holding Greece's feet to the fire. Let me share with you a couple of the examples that he gives of the way the Greek government functions, which his goal in this piece is to demonstrate to be unacceptable and irresponsible and overbearing. And I might add, so unlike or unrepresentative of international capitalism. Ratner argues that there is a need for structural reforms in Greece's inefficient, overregulated economy. The emphasis on overregulated economy. A major criticism of left-leaning, socialist-leaning governments is their inclination to overregulate and over-control the activities and the behavior of business and corporations. And so when you see a columnist, any columnist, raise issues about too much regulation, too much red tape, too much control, too much bureaucracy, then you have to be able to recognize from where that particular argument is coming. It is coming from a Wall Street executive. And let me give you the examples, because some of these seem absurd to me, as I'm sure that they do to a lot of other people. But I'm still left to explain why this particular article only garnered one comment in today's New York Times. He talks about Greece's overregulated and inefficient economy. Here are his examples. Take as one small example, he says, medications. Greece is one of the few European countries that sets prices for over-the-counter drugs, which can be sold only in licensed pharmacies. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development reported. So Greece so regulates the sale of pharmaceuticals that it regulates pharmacists and sets prices for over-the-counter drugs. Pause there for a moment. We know that one of the major causes of the enormous increase in healthcare costs in the United States is the seemingly uncontrollable price of over-the-counter drugs. There was an article this week about a new drug that is being developed and getting very positive research results on treating hepatitis C, which is becoming a major medical issue in the United States. This particular drug, which is being developed by a pharmaceutical company in California, sells for more than $1,050 per pill. Per pill. Immediately, that raises issues. Is this particular medication being priced based on the idea that we need to get as much as we can, and those who can pay will, and those who can't pay we can't afford to worry about? If that's true, then hepatitis C is going to get an awful lot of American citizens who are unable to afford medication that exceeds $1,000 per dosage. The Greek government doesn't allow this because the Greek government sets the price. In other words, it basically says this medication is important. People have to have access to it. Therefore, this is what it will sell for and no more. I'm not necessarily defending one over the other. I'm not saying clearly the Greek government is 100% in the right here, and our government is wrong. But there's absolutely no question, because you'll remember, I know that I do, during the administration of George W. Bush, when the issue came down about the ability of the Food and Drug Administration to negotiate prices with pharmaceutical companies, and the Bush administration denied them that right. In other words, free license for some pharmaceutical companies to charge whatever they felt they could get away with. And it drove the cost of Medicare way up. And there was a lot of negative flack about that. But again, my job is not to say here at the Virtual Center, is not to say we should do this rather than that. I don't have that right. That's a decision that I want you all to make. But in order to make it, you got to have the information and you got to know what the issues are. My point is to share with you what Stephen Ratner is saying in the New York Times this morning. He is saying what one would expect a Wall Street executive to say, that an example of some extreme inefficient overregulation is the setting of prices for pharmaceuticals. I'm going to say something here and go back to the founders for a moment. That's going to seem like heresy. In Federalist number 51, James Madison made the very famous comment that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. But men are not angels. And therefore societies feel the need to create government in order to basically ensure that people will do the right thing, because if left alone, they're more inclined to do the wrong thing. Does that mean that James Madison was a socialist? Of course not. But it speaks to what Madison believed is the way man really is. And the more we get to understand international capitalism, free market capitalism, the more we begin to realize that this is the way corporate behavior is. Whatever it'll pay, whatever people will pay, that's what the price ought to be. And the way you set prices according to the market, the freedom of the market, is if nobody's buying it, then it's too expensive. If many people are buying it, it's not expensive enough. And so these decisions are being made with no consideration at all to the needs of the patient, the needs of the consumer. So if corporations and the system of capitalism itself is not going to take into consideration the moral questions associated with right and wrong and fairness and dignity and all the rest of it, then who will? Well, in this case, the Greek government said, we will. And Ratner is taking them to task for that. I'm not criticizing Ratner so much for that as hoping that this helps to explain where he's coming from and what this is indeed all about. He goes on He says that in Greece, pharmacies must be owned by licensed pharmacists, and each can only own one pharmacy. In other words, big business is not going to take over the pharmaceutical industry in Greece to the point that there are one or two providers setting prices. Nobody can own more than one pharmacy. And then Ratner points out other rules dictate where new pharmacies may open, as well as their operating hours. And Ratner concludes, because this is what capitalism concludes, as a result from these kind of over-regulations, prices for consumers are higher, as well as the retail margins for the pharmacies. In other words, because of these kinds of tight, rigid regulations, there's less money to be made in pharmaceuticals in Greece. Therefore, the argument is people aren't going to spend the time developing new drugs and new cures for diseases and all the rest of it. And the prices that people are going to have to pay are going to be higher because there's not the competition that brings down prices. Ratner goes on to say that pharmaceuticals is not the only area. He says that in Greece, entry, which means your ability to get a job in, entry is restricted in a number of fields, including taxi and truck drivers, engineers, notaries, actuaries, and bailiffs. Most shops are required to close on Sundays. Greece is the only country in Europe that by law limits the shelf life of milk to 5 days, leading to higher prices and restricted choice for consumers, and on and on. In other words, what Ratner is doing is bringing forth the arguments that free enterprise uses to criticize overregulation, big government, socialism. I think it's important to know that. He also goes on to talk about what he calls Greece's Swiss cheese-like tax system. Greece, he says, runs a Swiss cheese-like tax system in which large sections of the economy, such as electricity, hotels, and many of the country's islands, fall under a lower rate of value-added tax. Under the agreements that Greece has been required to meet now as a result of this crisis, there would be a higher, more streamlined tax rate with few exceptions. So what Ratner is pointing out is we ought to be thanking Germany for forcing Greece to make these reforms, because prior to the reforms, Greece was living way beyond its means. It was incurring more and more debt. It was not paying its debt obligations. And it was obviously reluctant to tighten the screws and apply the behaviors required for economic viability, and economic stability. And he closes by saying, the latest turn of events is already exceedingly unpopular in Greece. That's understandable. But in reality, Germany and other tough-minded European nations should be thanked for forcing Greece to bring its economy into the 21st century, unquote. Obviously then, with this kind of an economic perspective and these kinds of economic criticisms of the behavior of the Greek government, it stands to reason that the creditor nations, especially, would welcome the demise of the Tsipras government in Greece. I think that goes without saying. And again, I remind you that this is in the same day of the New York Times as this article by Jacob Saul on Germany's destructive anger and the comments of German economists at this international Munich conference last week that the author, Jacob Saul, attended. Jacob Saul makes the point and says that while all points were important, but to hear it from these economists, Germany played no real part in the Greek tragedy. They just handed over their money and watched as Greeks destroyed themselves over the past 4 years. Now the Greeks deserved what was coming to them. And then he goes on and explains his interactions with these German economists. And he said, when I pointed out that the Germans had played a major role in this situation, helping at the very least by insisting on austerity and unsustainable debt over the last 3 years, doing little to improve accounting standards, and now effectively imposing devastated capital controls, Mr. Ehrlein and Mr. Fust scoffed. When I mentioned that many saw austerity as a new version of the 1919 Versailles Treaty that would bring in a future chaotic and unreliable government in Greece, the very kind that Mr. Ehrlein warned about in an essay in The Guardian, they countered that they were furious about being compared to Nazis and terrorists. When I noted that no matter how badly the Greeks had handled their economy, German demands and possible chaos of a Greek exit risked political populism, unrest, and social misery, they were unmoved. Debtors who default, they explained, would simply have to suffer, no matter how rough and even unfair the terms of the loans. There were those who handled their economies well and took their suffering silently, like Finland and Latvia. They said, in contrast, a country like Greece, where many people don't pay their taxes, did not seem to merit empathy. When you read this, all I can think of, is the southern slaveholder distinguishing between good slaves and bad slaves. Yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am slaves, as opposed to those slaves who would not buckle. What these German economists are talking about are nations who accept their debt in silence and do the best they can to make payments as required and say nothing. Obviously, what we're looking at here is a perspective that indicates, to me at least, that the fall of the Greek government would be right in line with what's going on here. And then there's the issue which many of the articles make, that one of the weaknesses of the European Union is that it seeks to bring under the same umbrella totally different cultures with different backgrounds and different traditions and different heritages. The prime example being, some people are born and raised with the idea that the first thing you do is pay your debts. When you get your paycheck, the first thing you do is write checks for each debt in order to determine what you have left to live on. But obviously there are others that don't do that. There are others that say, I'm going to live the way I want to live, and then when the bills are due, if I can't pay them, screw it. Well, that's what they're accusing Greece of doing. I'm asking, is this really a cultural phenomenon? Are we talking about a cultural disconnect here? Or are we talking about the nature of economic systems? Let me bring this first hour to a close, and I realize we're right at the top of the hour now. So let me just take a moment or two to wind up, and then we'll pause and we'll take our 5-minute break, and then we'll get into the second hour of today's program here at the Virtual Center. But thinking back to Stephen Ratner's piece, and Stephen Ratner's criticism of Greek behavior and overregulation, I would suggest that what seems to underlie all of this is the idea that a particular economic system, i.e., Wall Street capitalism, is not just a system. It ought to be and should be the only system. And that whatever the cultural differences that exist out there in the world might be, when it comes to doing the right thing as defined by this economic system, then everybody needs to be required, forced, to abide by the rules, whatever their cultural heritage and traditions might be. Question: is what we're looking at here an example of the extent to which international finance, international creditors, are engaged in behavior which is aimed literally at taking over the world by requiring everybody to buckle under and abide by its rules? Some of these articles suggest that some cultures are able to do this easily because it's so ingrained in the way the cultures have developed over the years in tradition and in the culture's values that there's no question. This is what they always do. But if, like me, you are a frequent viewer of programs on television like Judge Judy, for example, you are probably entertained by the number of cases brought before Judge Judy from people who say, I didn't pay my rent for the last 3 months because I lost my job, or my husband lost his job, or we had trouble putting food on the table, or we had to buy medication for my grandmother, or whatever. And Judge Judy will always come down and say, your number one requirement, obligation, is to pay your debts. You don't have the leeway, you don't have the freedom or the latitude to decide what debts you're going to pay and what debts you're not going to pay. You must pay your debts first and deal with what's left. That's exactly what we're seeing here. We are watching Judge Judy play out on the international scale, on the international scene. And we are watching the actors, the characters, and the cultures playing the roles that we have stereotyped for them. People expect this from Germany. I would suggest then, in conclusion, that this particular issue is so important. I think it's very important when a defender of this, and I don't mean a defender in the traditional sense, I mean somebody who believes so deeply in this system that it never even dawns on him or her that there could ever be a reason to not meet your obligations. And to begin to pat on the top of their head, metaphorically, nations like Latvia and Finland, who are doing what they're supposed to do and not complaining. And then there's this Greek government. Well, it's time Greece learned a lesson. I would suggest that this particular perspective is extremely important, recognizing that the Greek economy makes up less than 2% of the total economy of the European Union. So we're not talking about economic requirements and austerity measures here that threaten to bring down the European Union or to break the bank or anything else. In fact, George Will, in a column which we'll get to in our second hour, George Will made a comment in his column that the Greek economy is actually smaller in size than the state of Louisiana's economy. So obviously that's not the issue. And if it's not, then we really need to determine what is. And that's what we're doing. We're speculating here. We're playing on the Facebook page yesterday. I used the expression, we're kind of playing, kind of engaging in what-if history here. What if this is true? What if economics really doesn't have anything to do with this? Power does. What if what we're seeing here are the issues which we're going to see more and more of as the years go on, which raise serious questions? If what's happening in Greece is democracy, because 61% of the Greek people went to the polls and voted, no, we ain't going to do it anymore, then the question is, are we seeing an example of the extent to which democracy as a system of government is increasingly inconsistent with the 21st century world? Is the Greek situation merely a warning that democracy as we know it is on its last legs? And that the major power and the major decisions are not going to be made by this government and that government and the other government. These decisions are going to be made by international groups of investors and creditors from these nations who get together and determine and decide policy that dictates the world. Is that what this is about? Well, if it is, then we better know it. And the fact that only one person responded to each of those two articles in today's New York Times tells me that too many people out there, intelligent people, because the people who read the editorial page in the New York Times are pretty sharp people. If nobody's responding to these things, then I would suggest to you that there are things happening here under the radar, and we here at the Virtual Center and the Head On Radio Network need to scream a little bit louder and a little bit more often, because this is potentially big stuff. I apologize, we've gone well beyond the top of the hour. It's 10 minutes after the hour. Let's pause for 5 minutes, and then we'll come right back, and we'll come back at 15 minutes after the hour, and that gives us 45 minutes left to continue our program. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I think what we're talking about here is civic responsibility, so we are well within the defined mission of the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. We're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Thank you. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to an abbreviated second hour of today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's abbreviated only because I ran the first hour over by 10 minutes, and I probably shouldn't have done that. But I think if you were with us, you know that I kind of get carried away by this stuff sometimes, and I hope that I'm not offending anybody, but I just find this material so interesting and so involved and so challenging. And I'm hoping that, if I can get this wrapped up in it, maybe a few of you will as well. And that's what I'm hoping. And I've always believed that in all my years in higher education. I have believed that this is the key to what happens in the classroom when people get excited about learning. And that's what I find myself doing. I'm learning as this material is unfolding here at the Virtual Center, and I cherish every single day for the opportunity. I truly do believe in this context. If there is meaning to being blessed in such a context, I feel that I'm experiencing that every day that I'm able to be with you here at the Virtual Center. Welcome. I invite you to participate actively in our program, and if you want to call and yell at me, go right ahead. But I hope that you will avail yourself of the opportunity. We do have a phone number. The area code is 304, and the number is 663-4676. That is 304-663-4676. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, our Facebook page is entitled The Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. So I think you'll find it there. And again, just be aware that today is July 15th, 2015. And if you'd ever like to revisit today's program, it'll be available, as are all of our programs, on the WhiteRoseSociety.org website. And again, I thank you. I kind of wondered at the end of the hour there, whether the hour and 10 minutes, whether in fact I had gotten a little bit too carried away. But on the other hand, I'm hoping that the points I made will be relevant, because I really believe. I mean, I have in one of the articles I have here, and I mentioned I had a couple of pieces, but one of them is really interesting. This is an article that is written from the perspective of criticism of the Greek government and the behavior of the Greek government, and it points out that that the president. President Tsipras is doing things which violate the tenets of what the Eurozone is all about, what the common currency, the euro, is all about. The implication, of course, of any organization is that its members will meet its obligations and pay its debts. In fact, there is the argument that the 11th hour vote, the referendum, falls short of international standards according to this particular perspective. Even more than that, the comments made by the president of Greece, the members of the European Union, for example, have agreed that, quote, these are lies from your personal handle, you crook, in making reference to President Tsipras. So this is this has become hot and heated. The other thing to keep in mind, and you know, one of the themes of the first hour, one of my intents, was to develop the idea that the fall of the Greek government is really a sub goal here, or part of the agenda, if you will, on the part of many people. And there's all sorts of evidence to support that. There is a piece that was written by Suzanne Daly on the 2nd of July in, I believe, the Washington Post, which makes this same point, that in essence that a lot of the behavior here raises serious questions about whether in fact this issue is an economic one or in real terms is a political one, and is really about the issue of power. For example, when we all saw on the news evidences of the Greek people trying to get their money and their retirement money and their pensions out of the banks, and the ATMs were limited to like $60 a day. The banks were closed. And so it looked like there was going to be some sort of popular uprising within Greece. Suzanne Daly in this piece makes the point that many people are suggesting that the timing of the European Central Bank's action in capping emergency funding in the Greek banks at this particular time, with the vote coming, clearly had political ramifications. In other words, given the desperation of the Greek people, it seemed like a very strange time for the European Central Bank to start tightening the screws on the banks of Greece and not letting them opening and not letting them respond to the concerns of the Greek people about their retirement, their bank accounts and their retirements. In fact, Mark Weisbrot, who's an economist and edits and co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., made the comment, I don't see how anybody can believe that the timing of this action was coincidence, he said. When you restrict the flow of cash enough to close the banks during the week of a referendum, this is a very deliberate move to scare people. And indeed, there is indication here the magic word is being used. I want to give, this is Stelios Kougliou, who's a parliament member of the Greek government. He makes the point and said the idea from the very beginning has been to overthrow Tsipras and get someone in there who do what they were told. This has been a silent coup d'etat. That's really, in fact, what this is about. So clearly, the implications here are significantly important. One of our most noted economists, and this is a quote that I used on Monday, I shared with you on Monday, Joseph Stiglitz, who was recently awarded a Nobel Prize in economics, responded to this particular issue. And Stiglitz quotes the following, and if you'll bear with me, I wanted to share this with you. Stiglitz says, the rising crescendo of bickering and acrimony within Europe might seem to outsiders to be the inevitable result of the bitter endgame playing out between Greece and its creditors. In fact, European leaders are finally beginning to reveal the true nature of the ongoing debt dispute. And the answer is not pleasant. It's about power and democracy, much more than money and economics. We should be clear, he says. Almost none of the huge amount of money loaned to Greece has actually gone there. It has gone to pay out private sector creditors, including German and French banks. Greece has gotten but a pittance, but it has paid a high price to preserve these countries' banking systems. The IMF and the other official creditors do not need the money that is being demanded. Under a business-as-usual scenario, the money received would most likely just be lent out again to Greece. So as the Greek people are being asked to tighten their belts more and more and more and pay more, the money that they are paying is not going to help out Greece. It's going to the creditors to whom Greece owes the debt. In a sense, what that means is that the priorities of the creditors are taking precedence over the priorities of the Greek people. Of course, all of that based on the recognition of the realization that there's an assumption here that the Greek people are responsible for what's happening to them because of behavior that many people argue has been irresponsible. But again, the question is it the Greek government that has been irresponsible or the Greek people? Even more than that, given what Greece was trying to do in some of the measures that Stephen Ratner, for example, believed were demonstrations, examples of inefficiencies and overregulation, I think what we're talking about here is the difference between policy being made with the public interest being the priority, as opposed to policy being made with self-interest of individuals being the priority. I would suggest to you that's a debate that went on here in the United States over ratification of the Constitution, and we've done a lot with that. There's no question that one of the most articulate commentators on the American scene today is an individual who writes a regular column in the Washington Post, George Will. And I know many of you have heard George Will. In fact, I've cited George Will a number of times here at the Virtual Center in previous months. George Will weighs in on this Greek crisis, and in the process, my goal here is not to celebrate the points of view of George Will so much as to acknowledge that what George Will is saying is what conservative voices are saying all around the world. In other words, what makes Will's column particularly relevant here is because he speaks for many more than just himself. He is articulating a perspective here, a point of view here, which I think all of us need to recognize because it's an important part of the story. And so it's important to acknowledge it and to include it here. I would ask you in a couple of cases to not only focus on what Will is saying, but also to note the tone, the way he's saying it. And I think you'll get the full flavor. George Will says, Tsipras, the president of Greece, is a peculiar phenomenon, a defiant mendicant. Mendicant, of course, is a liar. He urged voters to do what they did. In voting no, they asserted that Greece's dignity is incompatible with loans that come with conditions attached. Tsipras' Syriza party insists, however, that dignity is compatible with perpetual dependency on the forbearance and productivity of others, unquote. I ask you to note the flavor, the delicious flavor of the way George Will is putting this criticism of Greece. The party in power, George Will says, is insisting that dignity is compatible with perpetual dependency on the forbearance and productivity of others. Translation, that these people have behaved in ways which indicates that it doesn't bother them one whit that other people have to pick up the responsibilities for what they refuse to do for themselves. Obviously, Will is not speaking here just of the Greek people. He's talking about Romney's 47%, the people whose whole idea, whose whole worldview is to be on the take and is to remain dependent on those who produce and to do everything you can to avoid becoming a producer. And then George Will mentions the magic name, Karl Marx, an intellectual for whom labor, as most 19th century people experienced it, was only a rumor. Let me repeat that sentence. I've circled it. I think it is absolutely wonderful because it's so revealing. Karl Marx, an intellectual for whom labor, as most 19th century people experienced it, was only a rumor, detested the division of labor because it alienated workers. The criticism of Karl Marx, by suggesting that Karl Marx knew nothing about labor that people in the 19th century who did work knew. In other words, he was writing about something that he had no right to write about because he had never experienced it. I mean, this is unbelievable. In other words, Karl Marx cannot be taken seriously because when he talks about labor because he never even experienced it. Let me suggest to you that George Will was born to a philosophy professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana, went to a special high-powered high school, then went to Trinity University in Hartford, Connecticut for his bachelor's degree, went to Oxford for a master's degree, came back to the United States and went to Princeton for both a master's degree and a PhD in political science, and then went to teach at Harvard University and has become one of the world's foremost commentators on public affairs. There's little in George Will's background to suggest that he has any business talking about labor or either. This is an example of the pot calling the pot a pot, if that makes sense. Anyway, back to George Will on Karl Marx. But although Syriza partakes of the European left's unending romance with Marxism, its program requires a particular division of labor. Greece will live better than its economic productivity can sustain, and more productive Europeans will pay the difference. This is one of the most dramatic, direct attacks on the Greek government and the Greek people that I've read. In other words, Greece has adopted a way of life which is way above its economic ability to pay for. But it has made the decision by electing this government that we're going to continue to do it, let somebody else pay the bills. And then he quotes Marx. Until socialism arrives, Marx said, quote, the worker is only himself when he does not work, unquote. So Marx did say the worker is only himself, but he does not work when he does not work. George Will's interpretation of that? A sentiment many Greeks embraced by retiring on government pensions at age 50. George Will is taking Marx literally here about the worker's desire to find a way to get out of work. That's not what Marx is talking about at all. He's talking about man's requirement to work himself to death. And that'll only stop when some sorts of regulations and controls and limits are placed on capitalism, recognizing, of course, that Marx is writing it during the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. And then Will points out that left-wing parties in other southern European countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy, are watching to see if Greece can turn weakness, indeed prostration, into strength. In other words, can Greece get away with this? Because if they do, we're ready. We're next. And here is George Will's thesis. The real danger, he says, is a political contagion, a flight from free market reforms elsewhere. It is said that the European Union is a splendid idea, but that the euro, the common currency, is a bad idea. Actually, he says, the euro is a bad idea. That is the logical application of an even worse idea, the European Union. Will's point here, then, is to use the Greek debt situation to criticize the very existence of the European Union and its effort to unite Europe. That's the weakness. Where does he go for proof? Where else? Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, a daughter of the Mother of Parliaments, in 1988 said, quote, we have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level with a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels, unquote. And then Will goes on to say, to attack the existence of the European Union, and makes reference to the Greek government's efforts to permit a tantrum to masquerade as governance. George Will closes with the following. On September 30th, 1938, when French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier, when his plane bringing him back from Munich landed in Paris, he feared that the crowd gathered at the airport would be furious because of the concessions that he had made to Hitler. When Daladier saw that the crowd was cheering, he reportedly said, "The bloody fools." After 61% no vote was announced in Sunday's referendum in Greece, there was dancing in the streets of Athens. The message, George Will concludes with, that in a sense, this referendum vote, this no vote on the part of Greece, if we let Greece get away with this, is tantamount to what Daladier was willing to give Adolf Hitler in 1938. A giveaway. a mistake. I think George Will's piece on this issue is particularly poignant. It's really written beautifully. The sarcasm is just drips with sarcasm. About Marx, about what Marx knows about labor, about socialism, about socialism's desire to allow the few to live off the work of the many. It is so rich. It kind of helps us get a handle and appreciate the significance of this whole debt issue. We're moving toward the end of our time together today, this week actually, because today is our last program. We won't be back together again until Monday, and we may have to return to a little bit of this on Monday in order to complete it, but hopefully not. We still have about 15 minutes to go. I want to share with you, and I think the best place to introduce this perspective is in the context of the George Will perspective we just looked at. This is an article by Ellen Brown on July 6th that appeared in the internet publication TruthOut.org about the banking crisis in Greece. And Brown begins her piece by quoting the Pope on the reform need in terms of the banks of the world. And the need to introduce the issue of morality into some of these purely economic decisions. We talked about that a little bit. But Ellen Brown gives us a little bit more, because she links the Pope's comments to the medieval Franciscan monks, and most specifically St. Francis of Assisi, after whom the Pope adopted the name Pope Francis. Basically, what she alludes to is the medieval Franciscan alternative to international banking, which was banking for the public interest. She begins by addressing the issue of usury, Christianity's attack on the practice of charging rent for the use of money, borrowing at interest. The medieval church labeled usury as immoral and unethical, is ungodlike. Lending money at interest was forbidden to Christians as a breach of the prohibition against usury in the Gospel of Luke 6:33. But the fact of the matter is, she points out that there was a serious shortage of coin as the medium of exchange, and so consequently, the church was required to lift the ban on usury at least enough to expand the money supply. And this is the issue that I want to focus on here today. Expanding the money supply in order to improve and make more available the medium of exchange. But more specifically, in expanding the money supply with loans on debt, on credit. I mentioned that a lot of this stuff is very, very difficult. In many cases, it's above my pay grade. But I want you with me to try to understand the real world meaning of what this is about. The way you expand the money supply by making loans on credit. By making loans on credit, you are effectively infusing money into the economy. You are making it easier for more people to get their hands on money to purchase what they need to pay taxes or debts or whatever. And the only way that this problem could be addressed was to do something about the church's ban on usury. And the change was that usury was formally allowed only for the Jews, not for Christians, because it violated Scripture. But Jews were given permission to loan money at interest. In other words, to rent money. This gave Jews a monopoly on lending, and it allowed them to charge extremely high interest rates since there weren't any competitors. Interest rates ran as high as 60%. My wife holds a Capital One card that carries 27% interest. So apparently, the church may have gone to great lengths to kill usury, but they didn't quite succeed in burying it. The fact of the matter is, these high interest rates devastated the poor. There's no question that usury from Jewish lenders is the origin of the anti-Semitism that we see in Shakespeare, the stereotyped attitude about Jews as being money grabbers. If you don't read Shakespeare, look at Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. It became obvious to the Franciscans that something had to be done to help the poor get their hands on money, on coin, without paying these outrageous interest rates. So consequently, the Franciscans began to open pawn shops, what were to become banks, but in the beginning were essentially pawn shops, which would allow you to bring in items and borrow money against them. In other words, it would generate money for the economy by asking people to bring in their possessions. And these pawn shops would issue money based on the value of the collateral that you could put up for the amount of money that you wanted to receive. This becomes the origin, eventually, once we get through the medieval period, of savings banks, of municipal banks, of public banks, of banks whose goal is not to generate income for stockholders, but rather banks whose purpose is to increase the flow of money for the benefit of people. And it takes a long time before this movement becomes legitimate. In fact, Brown points out in her piece that it was not until the year 1515 that these Franciscan shops were officially declared to be meritorious, not just allowed, but a good thing. And consequently, these pawn shops spread rapidly throughout Italy and other European countries. And of course, they evolved into banks, whose purpose was to serve public and charitable purposes, not to make money for the investors, for the stockholders, but to make money available to people. And Brown points out that this public bank tradition continues in modern Europe. It continues in Germany in a series of municipal banks called Sparkassen that still exist. Many of you remember, as I do, putting money in passbook savings accounts in the 1980s and 90s that paid interest in the areas of 4.5% and 5%. In theory, at least, this was the intent of public banks. They were an alternative to usury. They were obviously a threat to private banks. But they established a principle of linking expansion of the money supply to debt. In the 20th and 21st centuries especially, what was called usury in the Middle Ages now is called what Brown terms financialization, turning public commodities and services into asset classes from which wealth can be siphoned by private investors. Private investors who are in this for profit. But more important, instead of individual citizens bringing in what they own as collateral for money they choose to borrow, kind of like home equity lines where you borrow against the value of the home you live in, what is happening now under the label financialization is that public commodities, public assets, what used to be referred to as the commons, property that the people owned. In other words, property that governments managed in behalf of the people. Parks, forests, access to water, clean air, land, national parks, commons, the Boston Common in the city of Boston, Central Park in New York, common places of beauty within an economic thriving atmosphere where all the people could come and share and interact together as citizens of a common community or a common culture. Now the way you generate money in the economy is for private banks to loan money on the value of public assets, which governments are being forced to turn into commodities in order to borrow money, in order to generate money in the economy. It's the way that modern nations pay for development, for economic development, for transportation infrastructures, for communication infrastructure. We hear all the time about money being scarce. There's no money. We can't afford to do this. The only way that we can lay our hands on money is for our governments to go to private lenders and sell public assets to these lenders on loan and to pay interest on these commodities. And the result is a viable money supply. In effect, one has to ask the question, and we're right at the end of our program, so I'm going to ask it straight up. We have less than 3 minutes to go in our program. So let me wind down this way by asking this question. What about all the money that the investors and these banks are making? What happens to the money? Seemingly, it's not finding its way into the economy. It's not being reinvested. It's not going back into the economy in order to expand growth, expand development, create jobs, provide opportunities for the masses, which is what we've been told the system does for us. No, this money is being taken out of circulation. It's being hidden in banks overseas to avoid taxes. It's going into the purchase of things like art, real estate. It's going into things which don't benefit anybody except the investors themselves and those that will inherit what they have when they die. And so if society needs more money, then the only way to get it is to make public assets available to these people on loan and pay interest. So we find that governments are paying interest. How many times do we see in states where states build schools and roads and other public facilities by issuing bonds, bond issues, and asking the general public, the taxpayers, to approve the issuing of bonds for the building of a school or the equipping of schools with air conditioning or technology or whatever. The bond holders, the investors, receive payments back in interest payments from government. Government must do it in order to guarantee that there will be money circulating in the economy. Is this a modern version of usury? Is this the perspective that is driving the whole situation in Greece related to the bailout? That's the question. But we'll have to wait until next Monday to answer because we've just reached the 3 p.m. hour in the East. This is Bill O'Brien. Thanks for listening. Have a great, great weekend, and thank you. Bye.